I'm Rick Loverd, the Program Director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange, a program of the National Academy of Sciences. Ann Merchant, who usually joins us, couldn't be here today. She's on taking some much earned rest, but she'll be back with us soon. Hopefully next time, I believe next time. If she were here, she would be telling you that the work of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine is vast in science diplomacy, and in particular recently in Afghanistan and Ukraine. If you want to learn more about that, I would highly recommend that you take a look at the Exchanges event, Safe Passage for Scientists, from January 1st, 2022, or sorry, January 12th, 2022, with the National Academy of Sciences Executive Director of Policy and Global Affairs, discussing his harrowing experiences trying to get scientists out of Afghanistan. So as I mentioned, I am Rick Loverd. I am the director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange. The Exchange is basically if you have a question about science and you are a storyteller and you are developing a piece of media, a book, a movie, a TV show, you have a question about science, you can call us. Sachi will put the info down below. And either Sachi or I will answer the call and connect you with a scientist. We've done this over 3,500 times since we opened our doors in 2008, including so many movies where grown-ups wear capes and tights. We also do graphic novels and video games. If you are a STEM professional, this is the first time you are hearing about our work. We're always looking for volunteers, so please do be in touch. Sachi can put some contact info for that as well down below. And you can find a recording of this show on the Exchange's website or subscribe to our content on YouTube to see these events after the fact. You can also subscribe to our Collider newsletter on our website if you would like. And so this video of the event will be available to everybody who RSVP'd for this email or up on the website later this week. I want to thank our sponsors, Howard Hughes Medical Institute. We also get major funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and so many individual donors like you who gave today. If you did give today, thank you so much for that. It goes right back into this programming. So we have two incredible scientists or science experts today, policy experts today, and scientists who will be speaking in just a moment. I won't go into their CVs that are vast and amazing, but I will say that Bill is the editor-in-chief of Science and Diplomacy, and he also served as the executive officer of the National Academy of Sciences from 1994 to 2011, where he played a role in the creation of the Science and Entertainment Exchange. So thank you very much for that, Bill. And Francis is a member of Joe Biden's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. They also both serve as co-chairs of the Science and Diplomacy Roundtable at the National Academy of Sciences. So maybe you can see the connection there to this event. For the Q&A this week, if at any point while either of them is speaking, you have a question, you can put it down where it says Q&A down here, sometimes up here, but usually down here. And I will be gathering all of the questions up. We're going to be getting to as many as humanly possible during the Q&A portion of the show. I'll come back on and be the voice of the audience, asking as many questions as we can. So then each of the speakers are going to have 1 minute for some closing thoughts, and that'll be the event today. So without further ado, I want to welcome Bill to our stage, and thank you, Bill, for coming to taking the time today.
Thank you, Rick. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I've been a fan of the Exchange since it began. And I think the Science and Entertainment Exchange has proven there's a significant overlap between the entertainment world and the science world. Diplomats have recognized the same thing with their world, a significant overlap now increasing every day between science and technology and diplomacy, international relations, and foreign policy. The science and technology revolution is moving incredibly fast. For foreign policy, international relations, it creates opportunities, it creates challenges and threats. It can also be quite disruptive to societies and to relations between countries. And I think every country is recognizing that they're going to have a chance to be prosperous and secure in this globalized, interconnected, competitive world. They're going to have to up their game in science and technology. So almost every issue that diplomats deal with these days has some component that involves science and technology, where that knowledge and expertise is needed. Many foreign ministries are adding science and technology professionals on their staff, science and technology advisors to the foreign ministry. The science community has also recognized that diplomats are needed. In order to stay world-class in an area of science, every scientist in the U.S. recognizes we have to be more aggressive in terms of international cooperation, and diplomats are often needed to help remove some of the roadblocks that hinder and get in the way of international cooperation in science. There is a particular advantage of science helping to aid diplomacy, and that scientists can talk and collaborate across borders. Even when governments are estranged in very difficult circumstances, scientists can still work together. And diplomats have recognized that that can provide some advantages for diplomacy, maintaining sort of a window of communication between estranged countries. Yet we can't expect too much from science diplomacy. Often it turns out politics in the short run is a more powerful force than science, but I do believe that science diplomacy can create opportunities. There are challenges and there are limitations. I'm going to talk very briefly about two particular cases that I think help illustrate some of the opportunities, challenges, as well as the limitations. Both deal with countries. The first with the Soviet Union and Russia, and the second with Iran. I'm a physicist. I was trained by distinguished physicists, several of whom were in the Manhattan Project. But after World War II, they spent much of their career never serving in government, but they were great science diplomats because they spent their time engaged with what are called track 2 dialogues with Soviet scientists trying to ensure that nuclear weapons are never used again, talking about arms control of nuclear weapons. And part of that was through a committee of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences called the Committee on International Security and Arms Control. They're still continuing their work today. In fact, there is actually ongoing a dialogue between Russian scientists and American scientists on these issues even now. There was also an organization called Pugwash who did much of the similar things. There were also institutions that were created. One of the most famous is the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. It was actually an initiative of Lyndon Johnson and Premier Kosygin in the late 1960s. The institute was created in Vienna, Austria in 1972. This year is its 50th anniversary. And it was created to allow collaboration between American scientists and then Soviet scientists on world problems, which both sides could contribute to. And to illustrate that when there is a window of opportunity on the diplomatic side, these sorts of track 2 dialogues can be actually very helpful, track 2 non-governmental dialogues. And when Gorbachev became premier of the Soviet Union, it turned out several of his science advisors for the Soviet scientists who were engaged with the American scientists in these track 2 non-governmental dialogues. And the ideas relating to arms control actually saw fruit in the 1990s with several of the arms control agreements that were negotiated between governments. There has actually been very active scientific collaboration since then, up until recently, between American scientists, Russian scientists, and also the scientists in the former states of the Soviet Union. But we didn't account for the rise in Russia of an autocratic, ruthless person in Putin, and now everyone sees the horrific Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And that's having significant implications for the Western science community in terms of any type of collaboration with Russian scientists. A lot of the Western scientists, as Rick actually talked about in the beginning, are trying to see what they can do to help the Ukrainian scientists as well as the Ukrainian people during this war. It's also had a big impact on significant scientific collaborations. CERN, the big accelerator in Geneva, ITER, the nuclear fusion facility in France, space missions, because they all involve significant Russian collaborators. And many of the former relations are being cut off with Russian institutions, although I think the Western science community in general would like to at least maintain communication with individual scientists. So the implications for science collaboration between the Western scientific institutions and Russia are certainly in jeopardy. It certainly calls into question what the future of science diplomacy is. In the second case, let me just talk briefly about in the case of Iran. Back in the early 2000s, both governments, the US government and the Iranian government, this was actually very difficult times between the two governments. There were not formal relations, but but they both encouraged their scientific communities through their academies of science to hold workshops and to engage with each other, talk about issues, not nuclear issues, but to talk about things like earthquake protection, environmental protection, public health, education. And so every year up until recently, there were 3 to 4 workshops that were held each year, some in Iran, some in the United States, some actually in third countries. And actually there was a lot of engagement and collaboration and understanding and trust built through that. We were told that actually that helped lead just the trust that was built to what later became the governmental negotiations between the two countries that led to the Iran nuclear agreement. Again, though, politics reared its head significantly. The hardliners became much more dominant in Iran. President Trump withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear agreement. And so we can see that, at least in the short run, again, politics is a formidable force, can overpower even the best goodwill and trust that's built between communities. In fact, one of the things for both, going back to the Russia example as well as the Iranian example, because the bonds were so strong between the scientists on both sides in both of these cases, it was hard to really understand what the other significant forces were in society that could overwhelm the apple cart in this case and make things much more challenging. So science diplomacy can open windows of opportunity for diplomacy, can create opportunities. They can sometimes make a great difference, as they did with the Track 2 dialogues in the 1980s between Russian and between Soviet and American scientists. But again, there are limitations in what they can accomplish, and we have to be aware of those limitations. And so now I would like to turn it over to my colleague. Both Frances and I serve together in the State Department. I think she is a rising star in science diplomacy. So if I can have her turn on her video, she'll talk about a few more cases that again illustrate science diplomacy.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, Bill and I had a lot of fun at the State Department working on this very topic every day for the US government for a few years. And we've continued to work on this now with our perspective outside of government and as co-chairs of this Global Science Diplomacy Roundtable, which was mentioned in the introduction. One of the topics in science diplomacy that I had the pleasure of working on while at the State Department together with Bill was the topic of how do we re-engage with a country like Cuba through science when there is a restart in diplomatic relationships that had been pretty much non-existent, dormant and non-existent for many, many years due to that estranged relationship between the countries. It was pretty clear that in terms of geographical proximity, the two countries shared a lot of environmental and ecosystem concerns. In terms of weather, climate impacts, there were a lot of things that when you look at the issues that both countries are concerned with, specifically with regards to science, that there was a lot that the US and Cuba could collaborate on in terms of sharing information, in terms of solving problems together that are beneficial to the people of both places. And so this was the driver for us to re-engage on the science diplomacy level with Cuba as diplomatic relationships were initiated during the Obama administration. And the shape that took was relationships between our public health agencies in the US and the public health officials in Cuba to come together and discuss, for example, infectious diseases that affect the island, but also, for example, the people that live in that close geographical region of South Florida. And how do you start sort of sharing information as warning systems start to get triggered? There was an outbreak of chikungunya around those years, that it was very important to be able to share information, scientists to be able to track cases and see the path of the disease. We also put in place sister park agreements to be able to share information about ecosystem status and restoration. One neat example is how the coral reefs of the Florida streets have been heavily impacted by fishing and tourism and the building of ports on several coastal sites. And the same ecosystems closer to the Cuban coast are pretty much pristine. And so better understanding what those ecosystems look like to be able to do the work of restoration on the Florida side. Those are examples of ways in which scientists have been able to share information for the benefit of people on both sides, right? And so, like Bill said, it sounds like a no-brainer, right? It sounds easy. This should be things that countries should be able to collaborate on because it's beneficial and it's a win-win, right? But politics and events in history do take sometimes precedence over this collaboration and this exchange of information and experts. And one of the things that has happened post those years of re-engagement in Cuba on science collaboration was the sort of stopping of that diplomatic exchange between our countries in the years subsequent to the Obama administration. And more recently in Cuba, artists and young people took to the streets to protest food and medicine shortages and lacks of freedom. And there were many of those young people in the streets that protested that were jailed for violating the law in terms of their ability to protest in the streets. And so those actions by the Cuban government have put even more barriers and obstacles in place for the US to be able to collaborate freely, right? And so there's a tension sometimes between the human rights considerations that the US must have and its desire to be able to have that free exchange of information and data and knowledge to be able to benefit its people. I think the second case that I'll highlight is climate change. And I'm sure that you have all seen the latest news on what the science is telling us on the window for action on climate change and how that window is steadily closing, despite the fact that we have had the knowledge for a long time, thanks to the scientists that have been involved in modeling the impacts of climate change and telling us that greenhouse gas emissions that come directly from the burning of fossil fuels are the cause of climate change. So we know why it's happening. We know what the timeline is on those impacts, and yet the ability for us to act has not been completely taken advantage of. And so this is one case in which we have had scientists collaborating on assessing the science for decades through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, through the reports that the UN issues, through the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We're talking about over 130 countries, hundreds to thousands of authors and contributing experts each time one of these reports that gives us the latest assessment of what we know on climate change. This is how many scientists from all over the world collaborate on this to get their governments to take the immediate action that is needed. And when I say immediate, we're talking about what the latest report is telling us, that our emissions need to peak in the next 3 years, and the actions in the 2020s are going to be critical in order for us to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Pact of last year. And so seeing these scientists come together and collaborate on these reports, they do issue this thing called the Summary for Policymakers, in which government officials and the scientists sit down and go through these reports line by line to make sure that the science is accurate and that they can say these things to the public in a way that the public can understand, and that the critical need for action is understood. And yet again, sometimes politics gets in the way, with the best science, with the best diplomats, with the best negotiators at the table, telling us exactly what our timeline is for action and what we need to do. In the case of climate change, we need to phase out fossil fuels immediately now. That's what we need to do. We have been in the United States and across the world unable to take the immediate and aggressive steps that are needed to stem the changing climate and the warming of the planet. And so, what are those political considerations that take precedence over science, right? It's subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. It is the influence of all of these industries that depend on cheap fossil fuels to continue influencing the economic growth of different regions of the world. And so, the ability for us to understand exactly where we are and what we need to do, that is thanks to the scientists from all over the world that have been collaborating together on this for decades, that tell us exactly what we need to do, and we just need to find the political will to get it done. And so, to me, those are two examples of where we have the best science, the best people at the table. We have the best negotiators, the best data, the best intentions, and politics many times, as Bill said, will get in the way, but these continue to be opportunities. And the fact that our scientists continue to talk through the lack of action on climate change, we continue to assess the science and we continue to collaborate through the difficult times between the United States and Cuba, whether it's because of human rights violations, whether it's because we're at an impasse, because our administrations are now willing to take steps to collaborate, even in the areas where we can find common ground. Scientists continue to collaborate. And when times are tough, scientists have been there maintaining those ties and those bridges. When we reinstated the relationship with Cuba, we would have never been able to do it with the effectiveness in which we did in such a short amount of time if it hadn't been for an infrastructure of collaboration that had been laid out by scientists outside of government for many years, to professional societies, scientific professional societies, NGOs, through the United Nations. Those scientists knew each other and they had built the trust. And that is essential for that science diplomacy to take place and to really happen and be effective. And so I believe science diplomacy gives us sort of a path through the dark and the light, where we're able to come together no matter what is happening on the political end. And I very, very strongly believe that we have to certainly balance the political concerns, the human rights concerns, but that there should always be a channel of communication open should we need it to collaborate on the hardest challenges that affect the people. Thank you. I'm gonna then turn it back over to Rick.
Hello.
All right.
I realized one thing. I forgot to do my rabbit hole, which is kind of important this week, because my rabbit hole is the National Academy of Sciences Safe Passage Fund to help resettle Ukrainian scientists and researchers in Poland. The fund was originally set up for Afghan scientists and is now being used as a fund for Ukrainian scientists. 100% of everything you give to this fund goes to help resettle people in Poland who are either researchers or scientists. So please take a look if you do have a chance. Lots of questions. I'm going to get to as many as I can. First, I see Karen and Brian's questions as sort of opposite sides of a similar coin. So Brian is asking about the idea that in economic terms, staying engaged with Russian scientists seems to be antithetical to a lot of the efforts to sanction Russia and the Russian economy. So he wants to know, how do these two things exist at the same time? And then Karen is basically on the other side, where she's saying, is severing these research ties doing more harm than good?
Yeah, I mean, this is a key question that the science community as well as governments are facing right now. I think the highest priority for the American science community and European is aiding your Ukrainian scientists, both those that have been able to leave to go to Poland, want to stay nearby and find temporary positions for them, as well as those who are still in Ukraine and trying to continue. With the sanctions, almost all financial flows are being cut off by everybody to Russian institutions. The key issue is, should contacts, at least some contacts, be maintained with individual Russian scientists? I'm also with the American Physical Society, and they are trying to maintain contacts with some individual scientists. They know that there are many scientists in Russia who oppose what the Putin government is doing. Others, Ukrainian scientists and the Ukrainian government would like very much to have total cutoff, no relationship whatsoever, even with individual scientists in Russia. And so that is a difference. So I think we're focused on the short run, helping the Ukrainians as much as possible, but on the long run, and it may require having a change of government in Russia at some time, but at least trying to maintain. There are a number of Russian scientists who have left Russia, and trying to help them, and also the scientists who are still there but are afraid to speak out because they know they'll be thrown in jail. But it's a delicate act trying to decide what is the best course of action.
Francis, would you like to add to that before I move on?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's a delicate balance. I think that severing all ties puts us in a difficult position to be able to respond to challenges when they arise. For example, I remember when the COVID-19 pandemic started, and most of the information that we knew about the virus was in China because of it originating there. And Chinese scientists had a lot of information they had gathered on symptoms. They had samples they could share, information that would have gone a long way to help the US prepare in advance of it being then called a pandemic and the cases starting to rise here. But at that point, even though our scientists were talking and ready to share as much as possible, it was very hard to get the higher levels of our countries to be able to come together. It was a particularly difficult and low point in the relationship between China and the United States at that moment. And so not as much information was shared through official channels as would have been helpful for us to really have a handle on sequencing of the virus, on many other things, shortening those timelines and being able to respond more effectively and sharing that knowledge broadly with the world. That is what those channels of communication that are maintained are able to do. When we sever those, we are also putting ourselves and everybody else in a very risky situation.
So, Miriam, I'm going to change this around a little bit, but I hope you don't mind. Miriam asks, when we see this so much outpouring of support around the Ukrainian people, Ukrainian scientists and refugees, are there similar efforts being made in African and Arab countries? Is there a double standard here? What can we do to change that? And if it isn't the case, what can we do to change the messaging that causes that perception?
Yeah, I'll just say a few words and turn it over to Francis. It's certainly true in the politics in Europe that they were much more welcoming to Ukrainians, immigrants coming over, than they were to people from North Africa and the Middle East. So that is a challenge for us, the double standard, of course, in the treating of immigrants. There has been actually a lot of science diplomacy in the Middle East. There have been active efforts between Israel, the Palestinians, and the Arab countries in the region. It's also had its ups and downs over time. It has helped in cases to open windows of opportunity for diplomacy. But there is almost all countries, no matter where they are, Africa, Middle East, even the poor countries, they all want to increase their capability in science and technology. And they do very much look to the United States as the model they would like to emulate. So even if they're not exactly thrilled with our government at times, they want to engage with our scientists, our universities, our high-tech companies. And that is an advantage, I think, for the United States in its diplomacy, the fact that it is looked to as a model, at least, for what it's created in terms of utilizing science and technology to benefit our society. And
sorry, Francis, would you like to add, or should I move on? Okay, so Darren asks to that end, I think, Bill, how do changing administrations impact the opportunities for science in diplomatic efforts?
Frances would be a great one to answer this, and she had to do the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. You know, back in 1999, I guess the late 1990s, the National Academy of Sciences produced a report called The Pervasive Role of Science and Technology in Foreign Policy. Imperatives for the Department of State. One of the recommendations was to create the position of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. And that's the office where Francis and I were in together. Secretary Albright at the time didn't follow all the recommendations in that National Academy's report, but that's one of them that she did implement. And the way it was structured in the beginning was to go from one administration to the next. It was a non-political fixed-term position, so it went from a Republican to a Democratic administration, or from one Secretary of State to another Secretary of State, even in the same administration. There were challenges that were brought in by when the Trump administration came into office. So maybe I'll let Francis take that part.
Thanks, Bill. So Rick, I think that the answer is it's very challenging, right? The answer is it takes a long time to stand up government initiatives and programs and funding. You know, it takes acts of Congress to assign funding to actions and then to stand up programs. It takes one stroke of a pen, 3 seconds to do away with them. And that is something that has a huge impact on science diplomacy with a change in administration that isn't a science friendly administration, or perhaps an administration that directly attacks science and chooses to not consider science or evidence in decision making. And so many things were impacted in the change between the Obama and the Trump administration, whether those were, for example, the relationship with Cuba, where scientists were starting to have exchanges university to university to explore research that was beneficial to both countries, and training of people that were beneficial to both countries, which led to a better relationship overall on other fronts, right? And so that's kind of the key here. Can you use science diplomacy also as a door? But those doors closed. And in particular, the relationship with China became much more difficult. That impacted our ability to respond effectively in the first few months with the COVID pandemic, as I mentioned. It is as hard to restart programs and initiatives and collaborations once they've been done away with, and once the relationship has been shut down, and once you've entered a difficult period between the two countries. Building that trust back up is a real challenge, and we're seeing that in the climate change front as we have entered the climate change negotiations with Secretary Kerry and his team, and yes, the world is extremely happy to see the U.S. back at the negotiation table. The world is extremely happy to see an administration that is a science-abiding administration. do they trust that we are going to do everything that they need us to do in these 4 years, and that we're going to get everything passed in Congress, all the climate action that we need? Do they trust that in 4 years there wouldn't be another change in administration that would roll back some of the progress made on climate? I think many countries are skeptical, and that is a direct effect of having lost trust in a change in administration when you do away with those science bridges.
So I think to that, and Ali is asking about scientific consensus versus different ideologies, and wonders if you have thoughts on pathways to a future in which more scientists are involved in making these sorts of decisions.
Well, one of the things that the U.S. National Academies has a special role in the United States of providing scientific advice to not only to the American government, but also to the American people, and doing it without control by the government over what the Academy say in their reports, and having a very serious process of appointing the best experts, whatever disciplines are needed on a study committee, and having a very rigorous review process before a report is issued. A lot of other countries right now are trying to develop that same sort of science advisory ecosystem. They recognize that they need to do a better job of sort of getting scientific input, not to control decisions made by political leaders, but at least get that input to the highest level in government. There's an interesting organization that was created a few years ago called the International Network of Government Science Advice. And it's actually to help countries kind of develop their science advisory mechanisms within. It's got both diplomats and scientists involved in talking about what are the mechanisms that might help facilitate this in countries. So it's another thing like science diplomacy, science advice. It's become also a very important factor for governments.
So Carla is asking what the implications are of the Office of Science and Technology policy being moved to a cabinet level in the White House, and is this a helpful development? And maybe if one of you could explain what the Office of Science and Technology policy does, just to make sure everybody in the audience knows.
That's for Francis.
I can take a crack at it. The Office of Science and Technology Policy, or as people affectionately call it, OSTP, is the office at the White House where the president's a science advisor sits. And that position historically sat, even though it was in the White House, and this person was a coordinator of all the scientific agencies and their advice for the White House, in this administration was elevated to the National Security Council. So this person sits at the table with all the other high-level decision makers, which was a very welcome development by the science community. It meant the elevation of science in this administration to parity with economic, security, and other considerations for the decision-making process that the president and his cabinet go through. It was especially important after spending 4 years where science had been pretty much demoted in the decision-making process, and when we were entering a period where we were still very much finding solutions to confronting the pandemic that had affected the country very much, and when we were entering a period that required immediate climate action. So two subjects that require science to be integrated into the decision-making across government. So having this person sitting at that decision-making table, the most important table, meant a lot to the scientific community, and I think said a lot about the value of science for this particular White House.
Oh, rookie move, everybody. I was muted. So Mindy wants to know if there are implications for graduate student exchanges when you're talking about collaborations between, I assume in this, Russian students and Chinese young scientists. Are there, going to be negative forces in those collaborations?
It's in the big scientific collaborations, some of which I mentioned, like the CERN accelerator in Geneva, there are Ukrainian scientists working there, Russian scientists working there, graduate students, postdocs from both countries, as well as American and European. So there is a lot of flow in terms of these scientific engagements of students. After science diplomacy played a big role in the renormalization of relations between the United States and China in the 1970s. After ping pong diplomacy, the next thing was science diplomacy, where the National Academy of Sciences opened up an office in Beijing to help facilitate scientific exchange between the two countries. And there was a big flow of Chinese graduate students coming to the United States for their education. A number of them stayed and benefited the U.S. in that way. A number of them actually went back to China. So, and one of the biggest concerns right now with the situation in Russia and Ukraine, I know of a number of graduates, postdocs, and graduate students in Russia now are trying to find ways to leave. They see that their future is really they're being cut off from the rest of the scientific world. And so they have a tremendous problem right now, those trying to maintain a place in international scientific engagement. So it's nothing to compare with what's being the graduate students and postdocs that are in Ukraine right now, but it is also it's a significant loss for the young students. In fact, one of the things that science did, talking about people who really know Russia well, one area where they would like to maintain at least some contacts going forward is with the young people, the young scientists in these countries.
So AZ asked, if one is interested, how can one become involved either professionally or during their free time in science diplomacy? And I'm going to give you two scenarios that aren't in the question. One is a person who is actually out there working in a different field, and the other is a young person who is making a choice about their career.
I can,
perfect for you.
I can start. I think that I'd like to maybe set the stage by saying I don't believe science diplomacy belongs to governments, and I don't think it belongs to any one type of profession. I think science diplomacy is a field that has been inhabited by scientists in academia, citizen scientists that have collaborated with peers across the world. I think it's been the realm of also of NGOs and scientific professional societies, of people just collaborated on challenges online, and so I think that in getting involved in science diplomacy means getting involved in the use of science for the betterment of society. We're living in a globalized world, and in the ways in which we can expand the benefits of scientists, of science for people, we're already doing the work of diplomacy. That's how we enter that space with a view on how we are part of the common good, right? And so I think that there's opportunities to get involved in science policy, which are much more formal ways of doing this, right? So there's scientists that go through specific programs and fellowships to be able to serve as advisors in government and work in government in different roles. Some of those roles are of international nature, and those would be a more formal in-government science diplomacy role. But I think that a graduate student doing work, doing field work in, forestry issues in Brazil, together with scientists on the ground in Brazil, is doing science diplomacy, is building those bridges, is building that communication, is working towards solutions to our climate change situation, crisis, and is doing so across languages, across cultures, and is building bridges that once are established and once that trust is there, is what helps us when we take the next step, right? It is when we reach an impasse that we call upon these people to bring us closer together. So I think that, viewing science diplomacy from that perspective, there's a multitude of opportunities to get involved, from the bench in the field to more formally, certainly in government. And I think that the stories we tell about science diplomacy and how it has served our country and other countries well throughout history, and the opportunities it still has to maintain bridges and open doors is, I think, really important. So, you know, I always think of for some reason, the International Space Station always comes to mind when I think of you know, scientists coming together, serving the world, you know, wearing their flags proudly, but solving problems every day together and solving sort of a long-term challenge, right? And giving us answers. And I think that's a very visual story. I'm one of those people that gets the alerts for when the space station is zipping by, and I go outside to see it. And it just represents this amazing achievement of humanity to bring people together to work towards a scientific goal. And we trust that they have left aside differences, that that they're doing the work for the betterment of humanity. And so that's how I view science diplomacy. I think you can certainly get involved through the formal ways, but there are always, and the people telling the stories about this are also a huge part of the science diplomacy community to me.
Yeah, the one thing I might add, both Francis and I benefited from a wonderful program of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the organization where the little journal sciencediplomacy.org is housed. 50 years ago, they created a program of fellowships for young scientists and mid-career scientists to have the experience of working in government. Started out just with Congress, and that's when I did it in the mid-1970s. Francis, obviously, more recently. Now it's a program where they're up to more than 200 serving on all agencies of the U.S. government. They serve on a 2-year fellowship, and they learn. Many of them go back to their science careers. A number of them stay and become professionals in government, or they go to non-governmental organizations. So it's been a great training ground for increasing the number of trained professionals in a number of our government agencies, including in the U.S. State Department. The other thing I might mention is that you know, science diplomacy is not just practiced by the government. It can happen at subnational levels. Many cities now have people that are engaged with other cities around the world. Georgetown, which trains many people to go into the foreign service, it turns out many of their graduates now want to go into the private sector because these big private companies have what is their equivalent of science diplomacy because they have operations around the world. And many non-governmental organizations in Washington and elsewhere are engaged. So it's something that the people can do, serving in government, serving in outside of government. So I think, as Francis said, it's open to a wide variety of interests and capabilities of people.
So Rich is asking if you can share some stories that you've come across within the realm of science diplomacy, some interesting anecdotes.
Okay, well, Francis is thinking I was involved early on. This was before I was in government, when I was at the national academies and going with government officials to countries where the U.S. was trying to open up for various purposes, one of which was Libya and Israel, Palestine, and Egypt. And the thing that struck me was we were having sort of dinners or conversations, you know, outside of formal dialogues with scientists in the countries. They would come over and say, you know, the best time in my life is when I went as a postdoc or a graduate student to the University of Nebraska or the University of South Dakota. The United States has done such a fantastic job at being able to train some of the most talented people who go back and help their own countries, but it also builds a strong bond with people in the United States. And some of the challenges we have right now with visas and other things, I'm afraid we may be reducing our attractiveness, being a magnet for talent for people from coming around the world to be educated here as well as to work here, and also to go back and help their own countries.
So John is asking, to what extent do diplomats, oh, I'm so sorry, Francis, I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I think there's so many stories, but I think One that I remember very clearly was on my first trip to Cuba on one of these science diplomacy missions for the government. It had been over 30 years since anybody from the US government had visited the University of Havana. And they asked me if I would visit the university and speak to some professors. It seemed like a very, very simple conversation, and it was going to be it sounded like it was going to be a very intimate setting, but I didn't understand the importance of that moment as I was walking up the stairs and I walked into the room, and it was a full auditorium packed with faculty and students who were so excited about telling me how they were researching different areas of environmental research or computer science and how they had tackled some of the issues of gender imbalance in the STEM fields and things they had done. Also telling me things that were not going right for them, very openly in the mic in front of certainly of government officials, when they didn't have access to science journals that were essential for them to be able to understand the latest work done and be able to contribute to that body of work themselves. And it floored me to see how so many walls broke down around us as we sat there sharing stories of women in science and the research they were doing and how proud they were of the many things they had accomplished. And we told stories and we shared accomplishments and we also shared challenges. And when I stepped out of that room and left and understood that I was the first person to walk into that room in over 30 years and have those conversations with them, it really dawned on me how science had opened that door in a way that our economic, political, all the other officers with all the other knowledge and all the other experience being negotiators for decades and decades had not been able to walk through that door, but they had opened that door for science and for me. And so it was a very moving experience. And it really, for me, crystallized what science diplomacy is about.
So now John wants to know, to what extent do diplomats want scientists to consider their country's diplomatic goals when they're engaging with authorities of other countries?
Very much. That's what diplomats are interested in. They're working for the national interest. And, yes, indeed. They want to understand the relevance of the scientific knowledge on the issues they're dealing with. But if you're in there working, and I came away from our experience in the State Department with tremendous respect for the real diplomats that exist there and the people that are in this profession. But yeah, if you're working in the government in a foreign ministry, you are working for the national interest. I think the national interests and the global interests have a very large overlap. And I think there's much room for countries to work together on the global interest.
So Mark is wondering how science diplomacy intersects with rampant misinformation.
You want to take that one, Frances?
Sure. I think that's one of the areas that science seeks to tackle, right? It is getting the best information in the hands of decision makers so that they're able to make the best decisions for their people. We know we have a rampant disinformation problem around the world, in the US and in other places. And being able to share information, to make that information freely available, to break down those barriers of communication so that we can exchange expertise, exchange experts, and be able to get the best science in the hands of those that can use it for their people, I think is a very important part of science diplomacy. We've reached a point, for example, in the pandemic, where so much disinformation about vaccines, the origins of the virus, things that really were not beneficial to us moving forward and in these solutions to the pandemic. But our bridges with scientists around the world were crucial to that exchange of information. To have the way to combat disinformation is to get factual information out there as often as possible by trusted messengers in the hands of the right people and in the hands of the public, so they can make decisions. And that is something, another bridge that science diplomacy helps build.
So I think we have time for one more. Oh, sorry, Bill. Did you have something to add?
I was going to say just one quick comment. But when I was in the State Department, subsequently sort of involved in science and technology foresight, trying to anticipate what some of the disruptions and opportunities, challenges might be. And right now, one of the biggest issues that the diplomats are concerned about, including governments, is on emerging new technologies, artificial intelligence, big data, robotics, gene editing, you name it, because they see that there are threats and challenges and opportunities. But in terms of when we were doing this a decade ago, we totally underestimated the impact of social media and being able to create what has turned out to be the challenges we have with misinformation. So scientists sometimes are not a better predictor of the future than anybody else.
So unfortunately, I was going to try to cram one more in. I don't think we have time for that last question, but you each have about a minute for a closing remark. Go ahead.
I wanted Frances to be last because she can be quite eloquent. And I'm not. Even with all the challenges we're facing in the world right now, I still remain an optimist. I think that science and technology have potential if we use it correctly to help solve many of the challenges that our countries and the globe faces. And the main reason that keeps me optimistic is very similar to what Frances said. And traveling around the world, engaging with young scientists in many different countries, they're very similar to the young scientists that's engaged with in the United States. They're all idealistic. They all want to make the world a better place. They're trying to see how they can contribute their expertise to doing that. So young people make me optimistic, even with all the problems the world is facing right now.
Thank you, Bill. And Rick, I think I'll close by saying, to me, science diplomacy is a space that we nurture through the good and the bad times. It's a space that we open up for that collaboration, for that exchange across borders, across political differences, across wars, across all of the difficulties that can arise in the world, so that we have that space to be able to share information, to be able to solve problems, to be able to offer people the benefit of science that they really seek. If you think about why people trust science, why are taxpayers okay with funding, the National Science Foundation and NASA and all? It is because they want the benefits of science to make their lives better, right? They want renewable energy that is cheap and at scale. People want cures to the diseases that affect their families. People want vaccines to protect their children and protect their families, right? And the way that we maintain that flow or that benefit of science for society is by keeping these spaces open. The United States can't solve all the challenges on its own. We are only going to be able to tackle those challenges if we have that exchange, if we have that sharing of information, if we take on some of these great global challenges together with countries from around the world. The expertise may be in a place where we haven't really thought of before. The best idea, the brightest mind coming together with another bright mind can help us confront some of these challenges. And so I think that's why we keep these spaces open, no matter what the challenges are, through the good and the bad times, through changing administrations, to science-friendly and unfriendly administrations. Science diplomacy is nurtured through the scientists in academia and nonprofits at the academies everywhere around the world, so that we have the ability to come together when the times call for it.
Francis and Bill, I want to thank you both for being here today. It's a real honor to have both of you on our stage and to really showcase your work. I also want to thank everyone who asked a question today. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. As always, we got to as many as we possibly could. In particular, Francis, sorry we didn't get to yours. That was the one I was trying to get to at the end. I want to thank all of our supporters of the program, especially those who joined at the supporter level. We can't do these events without you. Thank you. I want to thank Courtney Sloan, Sachi Gerben, Jeff Fishman, Amechi Ukpabi for technically producing. And we are off next week, but we will be back on May the 4th with De-Extinction, with the writer of the latest Jurassic Park movie and 2 experts in doing crazy stuff like bringing back the woolly mammoth. So please come and tune in for that, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. All right, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.